So good afternoon, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here today representing Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Housing, who couldn't make it to Madrid, unfortunately due to some personal matters. So I want to talk a little bit about the intersection of the right to housing and the climate crisis, and give you a very brief overview of the way in which the adoption of rights-based housing strategies can help states coherently address some of the requirements under both SDG Goal 11 and the Paris Convention in both the Global South as well as the Global North. So I promise I'll try to make it a bit more exciting than that very dry description I just gave you, but let's see. So I really won't surprise anyone by saying that we are in unprecedented times. As we often say in our work, housing and the climate crisis are the most pressing issues facing societies and individuals today. In housing all over the world, we see the number of people living in informal settlements and in homelessness on the rise. Forced evictions continue unabated. Homes are used as hotels or financial instruments by which profits can be extracted, and thus we continue to undermine the true value of housing as a social good and as a human right. On climate change as well, we all know we're hurtling towards disaster unless governments can make urgent and drastic commitments to lower emissions by 40% in the next 10 years. And when you analyze the intersection between climate change and housing, it is a catastrophe. To begin, there's the very first practical fact that natural disasters disproportionately impact those living in housing vulnerability, as Clara mentioned. Flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, and other extreme weather events destroy temporary housing and informal settlements. Rising sea levels threatens the millions of people living on coastlines, and those living in homelessness are increasingly dying by extreme cold or heat in both the Global South and the Global North. As we saw in the Oxfam report, climate-fueled disasters have driven an average of 20 million people per year from their homes over the last decade. That is 6 times the population of Madrid being forced from their homes each year. 1 person every 2 seconds, adding to the number of people living in informal settlements or inadequate housing. So what can governments do to address the climate crisis and the housing crisis? So 39% of all global emissions are caused by the building and construction sector. So we cannot imagine that we will build our way out of the housing crisis without aggravating the climate crisis. And we can't leave this to the goodwill of the private sector and their urge to change business as usual, particularly when business is so profitable. We need a new approach. For us, for the Special Rapporteur, the only feasible approach to ensure that the SDGs and the Paris Convention targets are met is to adopt human rights-based housing strategies that secure housing as a human right and not as a commodity or a financial instrument. The beauty of the rights-based housing strategy is that it clarifies who is accountable to whom. All levels of government, local, regional, national, are accountable to people. And as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Water recently just said, it is particularly the most marginalized and vulnerable groups. Strategies are also based in law, and they affirm the right to housing as a legal right for which remedies are provided when violations occur. Strategies also ensure rights-based participation that are inclusive of the most vulnerable populations, no matter their place of origin. So how can a rights-based housing strategy help mitigate the impact of climate change? Let's look at the upgrading of informal settlements, which is arguably one of the most complicated scenarios for governments across the Global South, particularly, who have to find a way to upgrade all informal settlements by 2030, according to SDG Target 11.1, while not contributing more to climate change. A rights-based housing strategy necessitates a rights-based approach to upgrading of informal settlements. This approach moves away from top-down building methods according to international building standards according to international building standards employing cement, steel, and aluminum, and instead it builds upon communities and their inherent capacities. promoting the use of local materials and sustainable building practices. It understands that the solutions to housing lie in the residents themselves when they are supported and enabled to become full participants in the planning of their housing and their communities. A human rights approach is based on the recognition and implementation of a legal right of participation of residents at all stages of the development or upgrading process. Aside from this being a human rights obligation, it's clear, or it should be clear to governments, that having the full participation of residents is the most sound and efficient policy. Failure to involve residents in planning and implementation means residents' understandings of challenges and their vital input on how to address them, like through the use of sustainable materials, is lost. Moreover, residents' full participation in upgrading or development programs builds local capacity for governance, promotes resourcefulness, efficiency, adaptation to local conditions, and local ownership, and ensures the achievement of sustainable and long-lasting results. This approach must promote the use of local materials and local knowledge for the building of housing. So implementing a rights-based housing strategy will also be key to limiting CO2 emissions in the global north, because it will force governments to fundamentally reposition the value of housing from the commodity of choice and a speculative investment as it stands now, to housing as a human right aimed at addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our communities. What we all need to get our heads around is that housing or residential real estate is the biggest business of all, valued at $163 trillion US dollars, or more than twice of the world's GDP. Housing is at the center of the global economy, and with it is the construction and the building sector. It is only through the repositioning of housing as a human right that we will be able to shift away from the view that housing is a commodity, and thereby shift the way we produce housing and contribute to the climate crisis. Just to give you one quick example, shifting away from housing as a commodity through the implementation of a rights-based housing strategy means states will no longer be able to excuse the building of hundreds and thousands of housing units for the sole purpose of investment that not only massively contributes to climate change, but also fails to serve the actual needs of population. I'm not sure how many cities you've traveled to where you've seen cranes all over the sky, and yet there's people living on the streets. That's what needs to change. So I think I'll leave my comments there and just finish by saying that it's really clear to the Special Rapporteur that governments must be proactive in creating a sustainable future, and can only do so by approaching the climate crisis and the housing crisis through a rights-based approach that places individuals and community at its center. Thanks.